This is Dr. Sean Pitman, a Seventh-day Adventist who has made many very public statements about abortion, statements with serious problems. So in this video, we will look at those public claims and compare them to the evidence, and this will teach us several important lessons. This will be a helpful and also interesting video because his claims are different than what we commonly hear. And importantly, we will also look not only at his statements, but also his style or tactics. As is often the case, it is not so much what Adventists say about abortion, but also how they say it. Once we identify the methods or tactics that Sean Pitman employs, it will be much easier to see the problems. Dr. Pitman is a pathologist in North America, and for those who don't know, a pathologist is a physician who studies and examines tissues, fluids, and organs taken from the body. Many of you may be familiar with Pitman, who not only supported the church's position on getting the jab, but openly, publicly criticized people who were in opposition, such as Conrad Vine, Dr. Leela Lewis, Liberty Health Alliance, etc. He said, quote, "I'm just trying to save as many lives as possible. The misinformation surrounding the jab has destroyed a great many lives already and is continuing to destroy many lives today." Well, remember this because it will be very important when it comes to abortion. By the way, I did personally contact Dr. Pitman, and we exchanged at least over 20 emails asking for clarification and pointing out the problems. So when you are watching this video, know that he was given ample opportunity to provide evidence. Some of you may be also familiar with Pitman, who around the year 2009 started a website, Here Educate Truth, to criticize or address the issue of evolution being promoted or taught in Adventist education, especially at La Sierra University. He has an older website, detectingdesign.com, where he responds to arguments for evolution. For those of you who don't know, the Adventist Church officially rejects the evolutionary explanation and, quote, affirms its belief in the biblical account of creation. Dr. Pitman agrees and wants church employees to support and teach the fundamental beliefs, and that, quote, the Bible and true science are taught as being in harmony, shedding light on one another. Remember that. Those are his own words. True science and the Bible are in harmony. I highlight this point because, as I have documented in many other videos, it's very common for Adventists, especially in North America, to claim science, 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 the Bible, 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 but when it comes to abortion, suddenly those don't matter. They are ignored. So what does Dr. Pitman have to say? To really appreciate the context of his comments, we have to quickly review the history for the benefit of those of you who don't know. In fact, the Adventist Church was founded in the year 1863 during a nationwide campaign by the American Medical Association to make abortion illegal. As documented by legal historian Joseph de la Pena, who was cited by the Supreme Court, this had already been illegal in common law at least since the 13th century, but the effort was made to codify it in statutory law. The American Medical Association's effort was led by, remember this name, Dr. Horatio Storer, and our very own Adventist pioneers openly praised these efforts, stating that, quote, the medical profession have taken a noble stand. As guardians of human life, they are compelled to do so, and society owes a debt of gratitude to who? To Dr. Horatio Storer of Boston. Our own Adventist pioneers were surrounded by a nationwide effort to make abortion illegal in every state of the Union, and they openly praised this work as necessary for society's good. Fact, according to their official journals, the Adventist Church unfortunately accepted abortion in 1970-71 for the purpose of making money. Fact, church leaders knew that lay members would not accept this, so they kept it a secret until the mid-1980s. That's when Catholics and evangelicals began protesting the Adventist pro-abortion position and practices. Fact, Once this got reported in international news, like the Washington Post here, this became a scandal. Church leaders then became creative and for the first time began to claim that killing little children in utero was a religious freedom or religious liberty, and voted in a new position here in 1992. However, the problem is that the 1992 position also contained the same misleading pro-abortion language and vague euphemisms that were used in Roe v. Wade and the companion case Doe v. Bolton to justify abortion on demand. It was the Americans who brought this into the church to make money. It was the Americans in the NAD and GC who covered this up. The church appointed a committee, mostly of who? Of Americans. It was an American committee speaking for a world church where opinion ran much more strongly against abortion than in the USA. It was the Americans who wrote the pro-abortion policies, and it has been the Americans who have continued to use their influence to misrepresent this. However, thankfully, as people have become more aware of this problem, it was reported here in 2019 that amidst growing criticism, Adventist Church is revisiting abortion position. It's revisiting what we should say about the Sixth Commandment. We lay members have been told for decades what a great document this was from 1992. Oh, they told us it's so biblical, and using their favorite magical word, nuance. Oh, it's so nuanced. But then, surprise, in October 2019, the Annual Council rescinded and deleted the 1992 position. Now, this appears to have greatly upset Dr. Sean Pitman, who, while this was happening, made many public comments at the Adventist Review, Religious Liberty site, Fulcrum 7, etc., and he published an article here criticizing this change. So, now that you have the history and context, let's address the problems. Number one, he says, quote, "These latest guidelines appear to me to put the SDA Church in the same position as the Catholic Church on this topic, with human life beginning at the moment of conception. That doesn't seem like a reasonable position, even for a Bible-believing Christian." This is false and absurd for several reasons. Just because we share similar teachings with Catholics, so what? That's not an argument. Adventists and Catholics, we both agree on the virgin birth of Jesus and his bodily resurrection. Should we abandon these beliefs simply because we share this in common? Should we abandon the Sabbath because Seventh-day Baptists also honor the Fourth Commandment? And Jehovah's Witnesses, they share with us the same belief about the state of the dead. Should we abandon that too? Dr. Pitman's attempted guilt by association doesn't work. Furthermore, the belief that human life begins at conception is not exclusive to Catholicism. This same point is accepted by virtually every secular evolutionary embryologist as the beginning of human life. The entire international multi-billion-dollar IVF industry is based upon the fact that human life begins at conception and at no other point. I want everyone to pay careful attention to this right here. He says, that doesn't seem like a what? Like a reasonable position. He claims to be appealing to reason and yet offers not one single piece of evidence to appeal to reason. You see that? If the Catholic Church, embryologists, the international IVF industry, etc., if they all affirm that life begins at conception, but according to Dr. Pitman, that's not reasonable, then tell us what is. Notice that he makes the accusation of being unreasonable, but can't provide any explanation why. This type of misleading rhetoric, unfortunately, is very common to hear within our church, especially from the NAD and GC, that we have to be reasonable and follow the science, but when it comes to abortion, all the science and reason goes right out the window. By the way, here's some important trivia. Contraceptives became legal in 1965 when the Supreme Court in the case Griswold versus Connecticut gave the right to birth control. And even our very own Adventist Church's official journal ministry admitted right here the historical fact that recently overthrown U.S. laws against birth control are traceable to what? I love this. Read this for yourself and read it with me out loud. The laws are traceable to who? To what? To Protestant legislation. It was not the Catholics who gave the anti-abortion and anti-contraceptive legislation. It was Protestants. But do we hear this today? No, of course not. Acknowledging that Protestants are responsible for this would undermine the narrative. Also, we have documented repeatedly Adventists, especially in North America and the GC, they are notorious for criticizing Catholic opposition to abortion, but they never ever cite what Catholics actually teach. You notice that? The reason that they do this is because Catholics are correct and Adventists are wrong. Since I've already published about this in detail elsewhere, I'm not going to repeat all of that here, but simply provide a brief, easy summary. We can cite from the papal encyclical Evangelism Vitae, which affirms that from the time that the ovum is fertilized, a life is begun which is neither that of the father nor the mother. Right from fertilization, the adventure of a human life begins. Now, contrary to the biblical definition that you are a soul, the Catholic Church teaches that you receive a soul, also known as ensoulment. However, this philosophical question is irrelevant because, as the Catholic Church clearly stated in 1978 in their Declaration on Procured Abortion, that biological sciences cannot define the moment when a human person is constituted, and that this declaration expressly leaves aside the question of the moment when the spiritual soul is infused. There is not a unanimous tradition on this point, and authors are as yet in disagreement. So, the Catholic Church teaches that you are a living human being from the moment of conception, but at that moment or afterwards, you then receive a soul and become a person. However, regardless, quote, the one eliminated is a human being at the very beginning of life. Again, quote, the human being is to be respected and treated as a person from the moment of conception. And quote, the deliberate decision to deprive an innocent human being of his life is always morally evil. So, the Catholic Church is correct on the point of opposing the killing of a living human being from conception, regardless of their philosophical views of ensoulment. Now, when it comes to contraceptives, the Catholic Church goes a bit further by claiming that each and every marital act must of necessity retain its intrinsic relationship to the procreation of human life. Therefore, married couples are not free to act as they choose in the service of transmitting life, and so the Church condemns, as always unlawful, the use of means which directly prevent conception, which by definition includes condoms and vasectomies. So, while yes, the Catholic Church officially forbids contraceptives based on their understanding of natural law as, quote, illuminated and enriched by divine revelation, our concern in this video is abortion after conception, and the confusion created because some, quote, contraceptives actually work by causing an abortion. As an aside, off topic, it's kind of funny or amusing to read how the Catholic Church defends marriage as a, quote, provident institution of God the Creator, whose purpose was to effect in man his loving design. The Catholic Church says you can't deny or distort or change marriage because this was created by God for man. But the exact same language is also true for the Seventh-day Sabbath, which the Catholic Church claims it can change. Anyways, now for problem number 2, I want to affirm that Dr. Pitman is partially correct and is making a very good observation, but it's an observation that ends up causing tremendous problems for his own church. After making the absurd claim that life at conception is unreasonable, he then says such a position, quote, ends up vilifying various forms of birth control that prevent the implantation or support of the early embryo as equivalent to true murder, deserving of the imprisonment or death of those who engage in such activity. Now, his statement contains some absurdity and falsehood, but he is partially correct when he affirms that some forms of birth control and, quote, contraceptives work by causing an abortion by preventing implantation of a brand new human being. Dr. Pitman, however, is trying to claim that using such a form of birth control would be equivalent to, quote, true murder, deserving of imprisonment or death. This is absurd and false for several reasons. First, when a man and a woman have sex, the sperm travels up the vaginal canal, through the cervix, through the uterus, and then up one of the fallopian tubes where one lucky sperm will find the egg. The egg and sperm then fuse together in the process of fertilization, which creates a brand new living human being. Well, this little fella is really small, so it takes on average about 6 days to travel down the tube into the uterus, where he or she begins the process of implanting into the wall of the uterus to receive shelter and nourishment necessary for the child to grow. However, some forms of birth control prevent this attachment or implantation, causing the human being to die. To his credit, Dr. Pitman correctly recognizes that if the Adventist Church teaches that life begins at conception, this would implicate the use and our support for abortion-inducing forms of birth control. So the first part of this sentence is correct, but very typical of the history of Adventists on this topic, he immediately conflates this with something that is false, that it would be, quote, equivalent to true murder, deserving of the imprisonment or death of those who engage in such activity. It is a fact that the government has the God-given authority and duty to regulate civil society and protect the right to life. Caesar can't tell you how to worship, but Caesar does have legitimate authority to legislate civil society. So it is fully within the right of the government to make illegal the manufacture, sale, and use of chemicals that are used to kill or do kill other human beings. Dr. Pitman, however, completely ignores this and tries to conjure up the worst possible form of punishment, including the death penalty. But this is also absurd because he's trying to move the question from whether this kills a human being and is therefore within the legitimate sphere of government authority to the form of punishment. These are two separate questions, and he's totally avoiding one and trying to jump ahead and direct our attention to the other. Second, this is absurd because pregnancy tests work by measuring beta-HCG levels that only occur after implantation. When the brand new human being travels down the fallopian tube and implants in the wall of the uterus, the body responds by producing a hormone called beta-HCG. And even the federal government, they themselves state a well-known fact: HCG is made when the embryo does what? Implants in the uterus. This usually happens about what? How many? 10 days after conception. The only known way, to my knowledge, to determine when a woman is pregnant is only after implantation, because that is the only time there is a measurable biological marker to determine the pregnancy. Dr. Pitman is asserting that if destroying the human being before implantation is wrong, this would be equivalent to murder worthy of the death penalty. But this is absurd because how? How in the world would the government ever be able to prove, number one, that you were pregnant before implantation, and number two, that the use of your birth control was proven to cause the destruction of the embryonic child? And to make it worse, on top of that, how in the world would you prove that it was intentional on her part? That might be easier to prove later in pregnancy when you have the body of the aborted child, but impossible in the state of an embryo. Sean Pitman has manufactured a completely fake scenario. He's made a straw man and then proceeds to dial up the emotional, inflammatory rhetoric to an 11. Look at what he does here. Would you be willing to take action on this as you would for any other cold-blooded murderer? Would you be willing to accuse such a woman of wanton murder with all the guilt that is involved with such an accusation, or put her in prison for life for such an intentional act? Could you really do this? I certainly could not, for the use of such standard forms of birth control during the earliest days following conception. Yet, that is what the current language of the Church's guidelines on abortion suggests, that these women who take such forms of birth control are in fact guilty of a heinous act of cold-blooded murder. Notice that he uses the most emotionally charged, inflammatory language of cold-blooded murder, in prison for life, heinous act, and he even uses the word intentional, which is absurd because, again, it is impossible to know if the woman's use of method XYZ has terminated the pregnancy, and the ability of the government to prove that it was intentional. Problem number 3, he continues and says, it also ends up vilifying a sexual relationship with one spouse outside of the deliberate attempt to conceive. But again, this is false and absurd because there are, and he should know this as a doctor, there are other forms of birth control that do not cause abortion. For example, has anyone heard of a condom? What about vasectomy? There are other forms of birth control that do not involve the moral problems of abortion-inducing drugs. However, I want to stress that while Dr. Pitman does make some false and absurd statements, he is very smart, he is very intelligent, and he recognizes that if we as a church affirm that the unborn are living human beings and that this begins at conception, it creates all sorts of problems. In my opinion, this is one of the reasons why Adventist leaders, especially in the GC and NAD, don't want to deal with abortion, because if they do, they know that it will have a domino effect and cause all sorts of other problems with certain contraceptives and IVF, etc. And notice the falsehood in this sentence. Simply because you affirm the fact that a new human life begins at fertilization, it does not therefore follow, it's a non sequitur, that sex is vilified if outside deliberate attempts to conceive. That is absurd. That is a non sequitur. Even the Catholic Church itself admits that, quote, new life is not the result of each and every act of sexual intercourse. Having sex does not always produce children. The problem is not in the act of having sex. The problem is when you destroy a newly created human being. As you are about to see, the underlying reason for Pitman's loud and repeated public protest is his belief that the human being in the earliest stages of development is somehow not really a human being, but before looking at that, as has been demonstrated repeatedly, people within the Adventist Church who support abortion have proven that they are incapable of forming an actual argument. They don't have the evidence, they don't have the facts, the science and history, and they certainly don't have the scripture, so they inevitably make absurd or contradictory claims. And a great example of this is when Pitman says right here, and I quote, "There are also those who actually argue that personhood does not begin until the baby is born in the natural manner and takes its first breath. For me, however, such arguments are contrived, since the baby could be born and survive on its own for many weeks before most babies are naturally delivered. Therefore, to feel free to kill such a baby for mere convenience is nothing short of murder in my mind." Pitman right here creates a huge problem for himself because he openly, very publicly rejects the notion that you are not a human until after you are born. He admits in his own words that the unborn are babies and that for, quote, many weeks before birth, to kill such a baby is what? Is nothing short of murder. Now, I personally contacted him for specifics, and he said that 2 months prior to birth, at 7 months gestation, it is murder. So Pitman, in his own words, out of his own mouth, admits that yes, at some point during pregnancy, the 7th month, the unborn are living human babies, and that to destroy them is murder. Those are his words, not mine. Now, this is a huge problem because when Adventist institutions teach evolution, he loudly and publicly protests. But when these exact same institutions honor the most notorious abortionist, who, according to his own words, murdered hundreds of thousands of babies, he has no such protest. Why in the world would a man expend so much energy and protest so loudly about evolution, but not when the murder of babies is celebrated and honored? Isn't that weird? Check this out. He says, certainly once the baby reaches the stage where it can sense, experience, and respond to pain and would be viable outside of the mother, I would be willing to do what? To take action, willing to accuse someone of a true murder for taking the life of such an infant. Allred boasted of killing over 250,000 babies, and he boasted of killing over 100 of these babies every Seventh-day Sabbath. So, if according to Pitman, the unborn become babies, then by his own words, a baby murderer is honored at La Sierra as an example forever for our youth. Pitman himself is a graduate of Loma Linda, and they also honor this murderer as an ambassador for the healing ministry of Jesus. Can someone please explain why teaching evolution evokes such strong and loud protests from Pitman, but not the murder of children? Isn't that weird? He literally writes right here in his own words that he is willing to take action, but when arguably the most violent killer of infants in all known human history is honored by his own alma mater and other institutions, then where's the action? Furthermore, it gets worse. If we can for a moment set aside these institutions, because Pitman has an even bigger problem, because if according to him this is murder, then his own church has officially supported and defended the murder of babies for decades. Pitman tries to manufacture some difference between the embryo before implantation and later stages of development, but his own church makes no such distinction. Throughout all 9 months from fertilization until the birth of the child, the Adventist Church has for decades defended the freedom to violently and intentionally kill that baby. If this is truly what Dr. Pitman believes, then who can explain this mysterious silence from him while his own church has supported for decades the murder of babies? I asked him, quote, specifically, what actions did you take to oppose the 1992 Adventist position which made no such distinction between gestational periods and therefore to some degree supports murder? Notice his answer, quote, such a distinction should have been made. Oh, wow! Dr. Pitman now, after many decades, now finally admits that this distinction should have been made, but he only says this in an email after being directly questioned. His own church, by his own definition, has supported murder with the 1992 guidelines, but now, over 30 years later, he finally says that something should have been done. And if you think it can't get worse, it does, because the 2019 position doesn't do this either. So I asked him, quote, as the 2019 position also does not preclude abortions after 7 months, what actions have you or will you take to address this problem? Now, pay very close attention to his response. Quote, when I was in the Army, I ordered the physical restraint of a mother who was trying to abort her own baby during the last month of pregnancy. This saved the baby, who was then adopted by another family when delivered. Did you see what he just did? If you can't see what just happened, I'm not sure how to help you. You have to be able to identify the styles and tactics that they employ. Notice that his response has absolutely nothing to do with the question. He just completely avoids it. This is one of the most common tactics that you will encounter with Adventists in the NAD and GC. Just provide a non-response. And as you can see here, other people have also observed Sean Pitman of being an expert at not answering the questions that were asked. So do you see what he's doing? Out of his own mouth, by his own definitions, his own church has publicly, officially supported murder in the 1992 position and continues to do so in 2019. And he won't even address the problem despite his own explicit claim to take action. Sean Pitman is a member of the Adventist Church, which according to his own definitions does in fact officially continue to support the murder of innocent babies. Furthermore, anyone who is familiar with this topic, the people who work for the abortion lobby, they know full well there is something that you can never ever do, and that is you can never humanize the unborn at any point during pregnancy, and you can never use the word murder to describe their killing, because the moment that you do so, you lose. You must never humanize the unborn, and you must never attach any type of moral significance to their destruction, because the moment that you do so, you lose. But that is exactly what Sean Pitman has done. And in doing so, has exposed a massive hypocrisy. Remember, this is the exact same Dr. Pitman who, for the last several years, has been lecturing everyone about the importance of saving lives. Quote, we're just trying to save as many lives as possible, he says, because He's a Christian physician. I'm just trying to save as many lives as possible. The misinformation surrounding the jab had destroyed a great many lives already and is continuing to destroy many lives today. 10 years ago, the World Health Organization estimated that there were around 56 million abortions every year, but now estimates that number to be around 73 million. To put that into perspective, the same WHO claims that the number one killer is heart disease at about 9 million a year. So take a moment to appreciate that. Dr. Pitman repeatedly lectures everyone about the need for the jab that, in his opinion, results in the saving of millions of lives, while he is silent when his own church publicly officially supports the killing of little babies to the tune of about 70+ million every year. And remember, the key distinction to make is intentional. Killing an unborn child by induced abortion is by definition intentional, but heart attacks, COVID, stroke, etc., those are not intentional. He lectures everyone of the need to act in order to prevent something that is unintentional, while ignoring his own church's support for killing children deliberately. And then it gets even worse because he makes the false equivalence between a new human being and an appendix. This is not Photoshop. He really said this, quote, "An embryo in the earliest stages of development is just a single cell or an unformed ball of cells with no apparent functional difference than a cluster of cells in my appendix." This is completely absurd and false because if you give the cells in the appendix food and shelter, then after 9 months, there will be, guess what? An appendix. Nothing will change. But if you give the human being food and shelter for 9 months, he or she will be born and start breastfeeding. Sean Pitman, like many people watching this video right now, is an adult, and he will one day be a senior. But he previously was a teenager, and before that, a child and baby, and 9 months before birth, he was an embryo. You did not come from an embryo, you were an embryo. Every person watching this video right now began your existence as a whole, complete, distinct, living human being as a single-celled zygote. Infancy, childhood, adolescence, adulthood, old age, these are simply terms to describe stages of human development. An embryo or embryonic is just as much a stage as is adolescence. Nobody ever says, "I came from a child," because that would be absurd. You did not come from a child because you were a child. It was you as a child, you as an infant, as a teenager, as an embryo. The only difference between these stages is time and development. Not only does Pitman commit the fallacy of comparing the cells of an appendix to the embryo, but he continues and says, such an embryo cannot think or feel or understand anything. There is no mind or intelligence at this point. But this also is absurd because there are full-grown adults who are knocked unconscious or in a coma. Is it now okay to kill people who are unconscious because they don't feel anything? Pitman is asserting that you are valuable or worthy of being fully human, or as he says, fully realized as a human based on your ability to do something rather than who you are as a human being. Your value is based on what you can do rather than what you are. According to Pitman, your value is based on whether you can think or feel or understand anything, etc. This, however, is also false and absurd for several reasons because, as was just mentioned, if this were true, then people who are asleep or unconscious or people in reversible comas have no value and can be killed. When I asked him about this, he said, there's a difference between being asleep, unconscious, or in a reversible coma versus not having a functional brain. To which I replied, how does someone in a reversible coma have a functional brain if it's not functioning? That's a really good question. He responded, quote, being in a reversible coma, like being under general anesthesia, for example, isn't based on irreversible brain damage. The brain itself is still intact and can function normally once the coma is reversed. This isn't the same thing as being brain dead or not having a brain at all. The key phrase is here, can function normally once the coma is reversed. According to Sean Pitman, it is okay to kill human beings as long as they don't have a functional brain. But if that's true, then we can kill people in a coma. Now here, Pitman is in a really tough spot, so he tries to change the argument that you don't need a functioning brain. You merely have to possess the potential for a functioning brain, that this state is only temporary. The problem is that in the same way, the embryo has the same potential or capacity because the embryo is of the exact same kind as the adult human. The only difference is level of development. The human being as embryo does not at some later point in time mysteriously and magically pluck out of the ether the ability to think or feel. That ability is already present in its root form at the moment of fertilization. The ability to think and feel and build rocket ships and to smile and to make decisions is already written in its DNA. Professors Robert George and Christopher Tollefson address this in great detail in their excellent book Embryo, stating, "Human beings possess this radical capacity by virtue of the kind of entity they are, and they possess it by coming into being as that kind of entity. Human embryos and fetuses cannot, of course, immediately exercise these capacities, but because they are human beings, not dogs, cats, or squirrels, they will, if not prevented by extrinsic causes, in due course and by, highlight this phrase, intrinsic self-direction, develop to the point at which they are able to immediately exercise these inherent capacities." Pitman's claim is false and absurd because he is arbitrarily selecting a certain degree of a certain characteristic. For example, he says the embryo does not think or understand anything, but again, to cite Professors George and others, the ability to think and understand come in varying and continuous degrees. There is an infinite number of degrees of the development of the basic natural capacities for self-consciousness, intelligence, or rationality. So, if human beings were worthy of full moral respect only because of such qualities and not in virtue of the kind of being they are, then since such qualities come in varying degrees, no account could be given on why basic rights are not possessed by human beings in various degrees. For example, if developed self-consciousness bestowed rights, then since some people are more self-conscious than others, that is, have developed that capacity to a greater extent than others, some people would be greater in dignity than others, and the rights of the superiors would trump those of the inferiors, where the interests of the superiors could be advanced at the cost of the inferiors. This conclusion would follow no matter which of the acquired qualities generally proposed as qualifying some human beings, or human beings at some stages for full respect were selected. So, in other words, Sean Pitman is saying you are not a, quote, fully realized human being who should be protected from violence until you can think and understand. But the fundamental problem here is that because this is entirely arbitrary, then it doesn't really matter because everyone will have different opinions on when children can think and understand, in which case it would be impossible to limit the killing of children. He says that you are fully realized at 7 months. But others will say sooner and others will say later. And then there's the problem of some children who, because of birth defects, are born missing parts of their brain who, like one boy, was born with no brain at all. As reported in the news, this boy Trevor was born with no brain and only had a brain stem, and yet despite the odds, lived for 12 years. Adventists have taught for decades, like what Pitman teaches, that a child like this wasn't, quote, fully realized, and so could have, or even should have, just been killed. But the mother of Trevor said the opposite, that Trevor's life is for a reason, and that she thanks God every day for his life. On top of all of these problems, he has still more, because in the Bible, in Luke chapter 1, verse 36, when the angel Gabriel spoke to Mary, he defined John the Baptist as a son with the exact same Greek word for born sons and born children. The angel Gabriel said that Elizabeth conceived a son. The angel does not say conceived a clump of cells or conceived some tissue. No, she conceived a son. Son is the direct object of the verb conceive. Chronologically, John the Baptist was a son from conception. So I asked Dr. Pitman about this, and he responded, just because a woman is pregnant at conception doesn't mean that the embryo has a functional brain at this point or can think or feel or survive outside of the mother. Again, Notice the tactic. He completely avoids the question. You see that? He's like someone playing dodgeball. You can throw the truth, you can throw the facts at him, and he tries to dodge it. He's not even addressing the actual text of the scripture. And this is really interesting because this is not a human speaking. This is the angel Gabriel who stands in the very presence of God. And verse 20, people are rebuked for not believing his words. So I then brought up this text again, and he replied, quote, the angel Gabriel didn't define when an embryo became fully human, but this is absurd and false because it explicitly states, it's literally stated right here in black and white, she conceived a son. A son, the exact same word for born sons. John the Baptist was a son from the moment of conception. So thus far, Sean Pitman has failed and his claims have been refuted. But wait, because he believes he has one more important argument and evidence that comes from the Bible. He points to these verses in Exodus chapter 21 and says, this is evidence that, quote, the Bible also seems to recognize such a spectrum when it comes to the nature and value of human life. It seems as though the Bible values the life of the mother more than the life of the fetus. And he quotes the scripture, which reads that if men are fighting and hurt a woman with child, so that she gives birth prematurely, yet no harm follows, he shall surely be punished accordingly as the woman's husband imposes on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, etc. Sean Pitman, however, points to the Septuagint version, which reads quite different. Notice the phrase, not fully formed. And if two men strive and smite a woman with child, and her child be not fully formed, he shall be forced to pay a penalty as the woman's husband may lay upon him. He shall pay what seems fitting, but if the child be fully formed, he shall give life for life. Pitman points at this and says, hey, this agrees with him, and gives, quote, increasing value to the life of the unborn fetus as fetal development increases over time. He then goes even further and makes the claim that the Septuagint is the right translation and that modern translations did not get it right, that our versions of the Bible today are wrong, since this is a very serious claim with significant consequences, and because this is the only direct scriptural argument that Sean Pitman has presented, let's look at this carefully. First, as for the reasons why most translations follow the Masoretic text over the Septuagint, that is beyond the scope of this video. You will notice in modern English translations, this word here, harm, which comes from the Hebrew word ason. If men fight and hurt a woman with child so that she gives birth prematurely, yet no harm follows, and again, but if any harm follows. Sean Pitman makes the interesting claim that way back in ancient history, in the earliest Hebrew scriptures, this actually was not the word harm, but the word that is translated as fully formed. Quote, as it turns out, the Septuagint was translated from a more ancient Hebrew text than what was used subsequently by the Jewish Rabbinic Masoretic Hebrew texts. And as sometimes happens as languages change and evolve over time, the meaning of particular words and phrases may also change and evolve over time. Now, to those of you who are serious students of the Bible, this is very interesting. So we really want to know, what evidence does Pitman have for this claim? All of our translations of the Bible are wrong, but the Septuagint is correct. How does Pitman know this? As I have repeatedly stated in previous videos, whenever Adventists in North America and the GC provide some source to justify abortion, you always have to go back and read the actual source because, as has been demonstrated repeatedly, it invariably involves some distortion or just outright imaginary nonsense. Well, he cites as his source a paper by a Thomas McDaniel, PhD. McDaniel, now deceased, was professor of Old Testament at Palmer Theological Seminary, a Baptist school in Pennsylvania. In 2012, 2 years before his passing, Palmer published this paper titled, "The Septuagint Has the Correct Translation of Exodus 21, 22 to 23. And when I say published, it was done so through his school's website, not through any scholarly journal or publication, which will make sense in just a moment. Now, How in the world does McDaniel know that our translations of the Bible from the Hebrew text are wrong? This right here, which you see on your screen, is the Hebrew word ason, meaning harm, mischief, or disaster. McDaniel argues that in the very ancient version of Hebrew, it was not ason, but a word that looked very similar to, quote, early Israelite and Alexandrian dialects of Hebrew, which became what? Became lost in the later Judean and Samaritan Hebrew dialect. This lost word, he argues, was what was used to translate the Hebrew into Greek. Now, this by itself, it's no evidence, it's just a claim. McDaniel is just making an assertion, so we really want to know what evidence exactly does McDaniel have, and for this, you may want to pause your video, go into the kitchen, and get a bowl of popcorn and grab a drink, and get ready because this is entertaining. He begins his whole argument with the magical phrase, once upon a time. Sean Pitman has presented multiple absurd and false arguments to justify support for abortion, but he only provides just one appeal to the Bible, and his appeal is based on a paper written in 2012, wherein the entire argument is based upon the fairy tale Once Upon a Time, pulled completely out of the author's imagination. Any serious students of the Bible will find it quite amusing that the author admits this fairy tale interpretation, quote, has yet to be recognized by the Hebrew lexicographers. Wow, really? You mean serious scholars and lexicographers don't rely on fairy tales? How can that be? What is going on? Now, I asked Pitman about this problem, and he steadfastly asserted that, quote, McDaniels gives a reasonable basis for this different interpretation. Pitman then shared quotes from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Jewish contemporary Torah, and the Samaritan Pentateuch, and said, and I quote, taken together, it is reasonable to conclude that this is all in line with the Septuagint texts. But this is absurd and false because both the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Samaritan Pentateuch agree with the Hebrew. All three of these, the Masoretic text, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Samaritan version, all agree. And the problem gets really bad because the Samaritans had no dealings with the Jews. And even in their own version of the Torah, it still agrees with the Hebrew. He claims these are in line with the Septuagint, but not only is this false, but both this text and throughout the entire Old and New Testaments, the authors of the Bible repeatedly defined the unborn as living human children with the exact same Greek and Hebrew words for born children without any distinction for age of gestation. Furthermore, if you just stop and think about the timeline, the problem gets even worse because Pitman is arguing that supposedly when the first 5 books of the Bible were translated into Greek, estimated around 250 BC, that they had the correct understanding. But that's a serious problem because not only are the Dead Sea Scrolls dated to around the same time or within 100 years or so, but hundreds of years later, the angel Gabriel shows up on the scene and defines John the Baptist as a child from conception. This is a serious contradiction, which puts us in a dilemma. So who do we believe? Sean Pitman or the angel Gabriel from the presence of God? Why in the world would the angel from the very presence of God deliver a message that would contradict the Bible? This is a massive problem for Sean Pitman, and he simply has no way to get around this. There's just nothing he can do. To everyone watching this video, you need to be taking notes. Within Adventism and even other denominations, the most popular Bible verses cited in favor of pro-life are, of course, Jeremiah chapter 1 verse 5, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and Psalm 139, for you formed my inward parts, you covered me in my mother's womb. However, while these sound nice, they are not helpful with many people within Adventism like Sean Pitman because they don't do 2 things. Number 1, they don't use concrete physical language to describe the nature of the unborn. And number 2, they don't say anything about the chronology, the time period when such nature is obtained. Luke 1:36, however, does that and more. It defines the unborn as children with the same word used for born children, and it puts the beginning at conception. And on top of this, it's not a person speaking, it's the angel Gabriel. Cross-reference this with other verses like Psalm 51 verse 5, in sin my mother conceived me. The verb conceived is of course in the third person singular, and the suffix in Hebrew is the first person singular. What did my mother conceive? She conceived me. She did not conceive a clump of cells that would later become me. No, she conceived me. Finally, to really appreciate how absurd this is, remember that abortion, as we talk about it today, is something very intentional and deliberate. This scripture from Exodus, cited by Pitman, is explicitly for unintentional accidents. No effort whatsoever is being made to go into the mother's body and to intentionally end the life of the unborn child. So this is completely out of context and has nothing whatsoever to do with abortion. I asked Pitman why he did this, and he replied, quote, the point being that if the Septuagint is right, then this indicated a change in personhood for the embryo fetus during the development for Hebrew understanding. But not only does he again completely dodge the problem of intentional versus unintentional, but this again just takes him back to the other problems, including Luke 1:36, which he was unable to answer. And furthermore, as if all of this wasn't bad enough, it gets worse. Because even if for a moment we suspend judgment and just see the argument. Now, let's just suppose in our imagination that Pitman is correct. Our Bibles are wrong and the Septuagint is correct. The unborn are not living human children until the 7th month, whatever, etc. Even if we accept this as true, then please notice that by his own argument, the Septuagint still provides a penalty for killing the unformed. Even when unformed, there is still a penalty, which of course begs the question why. So I asked him, quote, why is there a penalty for killing the unformed pregnancy if it's only a cluster of cells? And his reply, perhaps time loss? Regardless, the penalty isn't the same as the penalty for the murder of a human being. But the point is, it's still a penalty. Pitman is proving the whole point. So I asked him, if you affirm that a penalty is warranted even for a cluster of cells, are you supportive of penalties for women who end their pregnancy before the 7th month? He replied, the passage in Exodus 21 says that the fine is based on what the husband demands and the court allows. If the husband doesn't demand anything, then what? Setting aside the obvious problem of comparing unintentional to intentional killing, notice that even his very best, most creative efforts still leaves him stuck with the need to affirm that yes, punishment is warranted for women who kill their unborn early in pregnancy. So he says the penalty is not the same. So what? There is still a penalty. And if the husband doesn't want to give a penalty, so what? If he does so, you still have to punish her. The reason I am giving this detailed response is because there's an important lesson to learn here. Adventists in North America, like Sean Pitman, just love to profess that they are Christians who uphold the Bible as true and authoritative, but at the same time try to come up with some clever way to justify abortion, and in doing so undermine their claim that the Bible is authoritative. It's a contradiction. Please pay attention and notice in his responses, he repeatedly tries to dodge the problem. He is unable to form an argument, so he employs a logical fallacy like a red herring to distract from the problem. This is important because he repeatedly tries to frame this in terms of honesty. Quote, many honest Christian men and women see the issue as a complex one with several apparently conflicting questions and principles. And among honest Bible-believing Christians, there are honest questions as to when this line is actually crossed. Adventists in North America are notorious for trying to frame support for abortion as being completely honest. It's just honest. The best example coming from the official 1992 pro-abortion position, which states right here that there are, quote, honest differences among Adventists on the question of killing children. The obvious problem here is that when an honest person discovers he is mistaken, he will either, number one, cease to be mistaken, or number two, cease to be honest. In other words, yes, there are honest people who are honestly mistaken, but when evidence is provided to demonstrate the problem, an honest person will either make the correction or he will no longer be honest. Seventh-day Adventists in North America for decades love to employ the language of honesty, but as has been proven repeatedly for decades, even if you do provide the evidence of wrongdoing or error, it makes no difference. They refuse to change. This is relevant to Sean Pitman because he loves to lecture others about the weight of evidence. Quote, religion and religious faith can be, and I think should be, based on the what? The weight of evidence. Criticizing Mr. David Reed, an editor for Fulcrum 7, he says, the evidence is in all right, but you don't seem to understand it since you're blinding yourself to the huge weight of evidence that is actually available. The irony is that Pitman himself will repeatedly criticize others for not accepting the weight of evidence, but then when it comes to killing little children, suddenly the weight of evidence goes right out the window. When it comes to evolution, he will tell others, quote, I'm just not a fan of wishful thinking. But then on abortion, he will cite fairy tale language once upon a time. And now for the tactics, or maybe a better term is methods or style. With Adventists like Pitman, it's not so much what they say, but how they say it. So the following is simply how I would, in my opinion, describe what he is doing. This is not about the intention or what's in their heart, but simply observing what they do. Number one, the first tactic is conflating human life with personhood. There are two separate categories of the indisputable scientific fact that a new human life begins at conception versus spiritual woo-woo philosophical notion of personhood. These are two different categories, but Pitman conflates them together. And I highlight this because Adventists, again, in North America and the GC are notorious for doing this. They can't refute the science, so they try to conflate this in your mind with spiritual woo. And take a moment to appreciate the irony here. Sean Pitman tries to employ the false spiritual woo of Catholicism, but Pitman himself presents the same concept, that you attain the magical status of personhood after conception. Notice, the only difference between Pitman and Catholicism is that he just moves this to a much later point in pregnancy, the 7th month. In other words, by accusing others of being like Catholics, and then employing the same personhood woo-woo, he is doing exactly what he accuses others of doing. You notice that? The second tactic to be aware of is when Pitman also conflates what the government should do versus what the church should teach. These are, again, two completely separate categories, but he switches between them so that, in my opinion, he can use inflammatory rhetoric, and also because it serves to distract the audience. In my observation, church leaders like to resort to this tactic when they feel that they are losing. When you point out that the Adventist church is wrong on abortion, they will try to conjure up the, well, what about the government bogeyman? Also notice that he uses the most extreme language of cold-blooded murder and putting people in prison for life. But this is absurd and false because there are, of course, many different degrees of crime and punishment. He tries to frame this as first-degree, premeditated, cold-blooded murder, but what about a lesser charge like involuntary manslaughter? No, he doesn't even mention this and instead uses the most extreme inflammatory language. Tactic number 3, as others have pointed out, is that he repeatedly gives answers to questions that were not asked. For example, you may remember this question here about the 2019 position. What actions has he taken? And his response was telling some story about when he was in the army. This has nothing to do with anything. He is completely avoiding the question. In my observation and opinion, this tactic is very common with very intelligent, highly educated Adventists. They don't want to avoid the question because optically the avoidance looks bad for them. So instead they just try to fill the void by saying whatever and hoping that you don't notice. This is important because if you don't give an intelligent response, then Pitman will respond like he did here, quote, without any details or counter argument, I'm afraid it's just not very helpful to me or anyone else. So Sean Pitman pretends that he is actually interested and concerned to hear an intelligent response. But even in the event that you do so, he just gives you an absurd non-response. Do you see that? Do you see how the game is being played here? The reason to highlight these tactics is because it exposes them as not even following their own rules or their own standard. It's just rhetoric for the purpose of manipulation. And tactic number 4, ignoring opposing evidence. This is a really good one. If you read Pitman's articles about evolution, you will notice that he is very meticulous and makes great effort to carefully understand and interact with the arguments of people who support evolution. He is very attentive and very careful and reads their books and cites their authors. When it comes to evolution, Sean Pitman really goes out of his way to show that he understands their arguments when he tries to refute them. However, please notice that when it comes to abortion, he does the opposite, not demonstrating at all even the slightest interest in pro-life apologetics or arguments. Again, Adventists in North America and the GC, especially those who are highly educated, they are notorious for not trying to engage with or refute the arguments of those who defend the Sixth Commandment and the right to life. The reason is obvious. They can't. They cannot intellectually engage with the evidence, so instead, for the last 50+ years, they have engaged in falsehoods, trickery, deception, outright lying, or in this case, ignoring evidence, conflation, emotional, inflammatory language, fairy tales, etc. They are unable to form an argument, so they resort to other methods and manipulative tactics. And finally, in closing, let's end on a positive note. I want to warmly invite Dr. Sean Pitman to please live up to his own standards by doing the following. Number 1, publicly oppose his own church's support for violently murdering children by abortion. Number 2, publicly oppose church institutions who honor Allred, like his alma mater, Loma Linda. Number 3, publicly advocate for women to be punished for killing the unborn. That's according to his own standard. Number 4, if evolution is such a problem that necessitates several websites and continued public protest, then please be consistent and publicly oppose the church's teaching that you are not a soul until after you are born. That's very fair and it's really simple. Again, to emphasize, he has to do these things because, by his own words, these are his own standards. Anyways, that's it for today. As always, thank you for watching and have a nice day.